Well, maybe then we should turn to some of the applications of possible worlds that he had. And the first one that comes to mind, I mentioned it earlier, is counterfactuals. And a key dimension of possible worlds for Lewis was this notion of closeness. And what did the distance between possible worlds refer to if they aren't literally spatiotemporally related? How did he make sense of this idea of closeness? And then how did this figure into counterfactuals? And then by extension, I mean, at least in one direction, I think, to causation through counterfactuals. So I guess starting with what does it mean to say two worlds are sufficiently close?
Well, let me start off on this to see what Graham thinks and what you think. Of course, the first thing you have to do is mention Bob Stornacker, of course, because it was Stornacker and Lewis together who put the possible worlds approach to kind of counterfactuals on the map. I think what both of them were doing were offering actually an account of what we folk mean. It wasn't, in a sense, it wasn't abstract philosophy. They were saying the ordinary person in the street, when they say something like, had I locked the door, I would not have been robbed. What are they saying about this? Is rather upsetting thought they have. They think, well, if things had been much the way they are, with those bad guys hanging around ready to rob me, but just this difference that the door was locked, gee, something good would have happened. I wouldn't have been robbed. So I think it's quite literally that Lewis and Stornacker are saying this is the way to understand the ordinary person's reflection, which they capture in counterfactual thinking. And this is not just a philosopher's exercise, because when you think about your life, the way you feel about things is driven enormously by your opinions expressed in terms of counterfactuals. I mean, I gave an example about being robbed, but think about your most strongly held political opinions. Had Trump never become president of the United States, what follows that antecedent drives people's political convictions in all sorts of ways in America, here and now. And had Roe versus Wade not been overturned, and so on. I give you lots more examples. So I think that's what Lewis and Stornacker were doing. They were capturing the thought people have when they utter these counterfactuals.
Yeah, I think that's right. But you can't deny that talk of similarity is part of the way they capture that. And if you look at the Lewis Stornacker semantics, there is a notion of similarity that plays a role formally. So it's got to be doing something. They both appeal to this notion of similarity. They both understand that similarity is a contextually determined matter, depending on kind of similarities. Two things are similar if they have properties in common, and what those properties are may depend on the topic of debate. So similarity in practice is going to change from context to context, but nonetheless, they both appeal to this notion of similarity. And I think for both of them, it was kind of shall we say, a primitive notion, something we've got a rough idea about, you can say things about, but in the end, you can't really define it in any hard way. And at least I don't know of anywhere in Stornacker or Lewis where they defined it. That doesn't mean they didn't gloss it in various ways. So there's a very famous objection to the similarity stuff by Kit Fine. Because if you consider the counterfactual, and this is standard, it goes back to the possible invasion of Cuba by Russia, or the sighting nuclear missiles in Russia, and the counterfactual relevant to this is: had Kennedy pressed the button, all hell would have broken loose. Now, this sort of world's analysis of that is a world you've got to look at the world which are most similar to the present, where Kennedy pressed the button. And a world where all hell broke loose is not anything like the present world, okay? So that has to be false. And so similarity has to be understood in a rather strange sense. And then David replied to Kit's paper, where he sort of laid out a bunch of criteria for similarity. But these weren't definitions. These were more of a gloss on how similarity should be understood in this context. So I think the bottom line of all that is, qua technical notion, it was kind of primitive, which is hard to define, but you can kind of gloss it in certain ways.
Yeah, but part of what goes on, of course, is in lots of cases, the similarity pertains particularly to the time at which you're making the counterfactual supposition. So in Fine's nice example, the dramatic divergence from actuality occurs subsequently.
That's right.
But as Graham says, David wrote a reply to Fine and a general paper on the topic. And my memory is he had 4 rules you had to follow in order of importance. It was a classic Lewis exercise. There are 4 rules: first importance, second importance, third importance, least importance, and how you're supposed to judge similarity between possible worlds when you're thinking in terms of counterfactuals.
Yeah, but of course David was very clear that these aren't always going to work in the appropriate context, because we have backwards time counterfactuals. You know, if I had read in the New York Times today that Russia had nuked Ukraine, then, you know, the New York Times being a reputable newspaper, it would be the case that Russia nuked Ukraine yesterday. And so you've got to take the possibility of backwards counterfactuals. And for those kind of counterfactuals, the rules aren't going to work. And David was well aware of that.
And just to tie this back, though, to my question, when I use the word closeness or the phrase the closeness between two possible worlds, that's reflective of their relative similarity. It's just two different ways of saying the same thing. Okay. Okay, great.
Yeah. And Lewis is, it's worth mentioning here, Lewis is, and Graham's touched on this, was often a bit of a Morean. There were certain Morean facts, like that there's an external world. And he was a bit of a Morean about similarity, because, of course, as Graham's mentioned, he was a student at Harvard, and Goodman was there at Harvard. And Goodman was a bit unfriendly about similarity, and no doubt connected with Grew and all that. And Lewis was very much a defender of common sense about similarity. Of course, he took this point that similarity is context dependent, but he wanted to insist that we can make perfect sense of talking about some things being similar to others. That's a Morean fact. So rugby league is more similar to rugby union than it is to soccer. Bang, tail.
There are 2 more applications of the possible worlds that I wanted to dig into, though I'm sure there are many more. If there are others that you want to talk about, we can obviously talk about them. But one is mental content, and which I suppose is probably more in your neighborhood, Frank, than yours, Graham. But how did Lewis use possible worlds to make sense of mental content, thought representation, these sorts of things?
Okay, this one's yours, Frank.
Okay. Well, 2 things to say. The first is that David thought that thinking of content of belief and desire in terms of possibilities was intuitively very attractive. So take people who believe that the world is warming. Why are they upset about this? Well, it's because they got a belief of how the world is. You might say, I think propositions are the objects of belief, but why should a proposition frighten me? In fact, who knows what a proposition is exactly? But here's something that frightens me. A view about the kind of world I'm in. It's warming in a dangerous way, and I've got grandchildren. So he thought, and again, when you desire something, you desire a cold beer, I don't desire a proposition. I desire the world be a certain way, namely cold beer inside me. So that was the first step. Now, of course, as everyone knows, you can't just say the content of belief is a set of worlds where the belief's true because of mathematical examples and all sorts of examples. But that didn't shake his conviction that there was something right about the possible world's way of thinking about content. So that's the first step. The second step is if you're a kind of behaviorist, and remember we've mentioned Quine already, David in one of his last papers in the philosophy of mind says, of course, behaviorism is false, but you have to pay your debt to behaviorism. So he had a behaviorist background. Now, if you've got a behaviorist background and you like the possible world's approach to content, you can give an account of truth conditions for belief and desire. And now I had a whiteboard. I could do it for you easily, but I'll see if I can do it in words. When people behave, they change the way things are. So you can think of their behavior as determining a function that goes from one possibility to another possibility. That is, were things this way, this sort of behavior would make things to be that way. So you get functions that go from one set of possibilities to another set. Now, the idea is if you correctly interpret someone's behavior in circumstances, you can find two sets of worlds which have the following property. Were it actually the case that you're in the first set, your behavior would mean that you were in the second set. Okay, the first set's the content of belief, the second set's the content of desire. That's how you get the truth conditions. Now, with a whiteboard, it would be easy, but you get the basic picture. Behavior determines a function from one set of possibilities to another. And once you've got that picture, you then get truth conditions for belief and desire. That's just what I've given you is a lightning sketch of the functionalist treatment of how beliefs and desires get content. And in fact, it's in Stornacker's inquiry. In inquiry, Stornacker says, how can a brain state, if you're a good materialist, have truth conditions? And the story I've just given you is basically the story that both he and Lewis like. Now, one more thing to say before I stop. Remember, later on, Lewis became a big fan of the Daisei. So from that perspective, it's not quite right to think of the content of belief and desire as location in a set of possible worlds. Belief and desire, in his view, is more location in a set of possible individuals. So when you believe you're bald, as I regret I do, and I hope Graham's not insulted, I think Graham and I share this belief, what we believe is that we belong to the set of the bald. And that's to have a belief of how the world is, namely there's at least one bald person in it. But it's actually something more than that. And the extra bit is the Daisei bit. So the little lightning sketch I gave you to start with has to be modified in view of what David later said about the Daisei. But the picture's basically pretty clear.
When you mentioned that you belong to the set of the bald, I saw that. I mean, you also wrote that David contributed very much to, or very much is my words. You didn't add that he contributed to the literature on vagueness, and there's a debate over whether or not there is a set of the bald, because there can't be vague sets, and bald is a vague predicate. Where did David contribute to the literature on vagueness? Because I've never seen it before.
I think, but I'm going to say something briefly and look to Graham. I think David was always pretty clear that he was picking up on a supervaluations idea which he sourced in other places. So he used it in his work, but I think he was always careful to acknowledge that he was picking up the basic idea, maybe from Van Prassen, maybe from Fine. I should know, but I haven't done that bit of homework. Perhaps Graham knows.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember where those papers are. Okay, I don't remember where the papers are, so I don't recall exactly what he said either. But I think Frank is right that he was attracted by the thought that certain words are vague And what that means is that they do not have a fully defined extension and counter-extension, and you can extend them in various ways to complete the extension and counter-extension. So this is a version of supervaluation. And I think David was very clear that vagueness is only ever a phenomenon of language, not reality. So reality itself is quite precise. It's only that our language, which we use to describe it, is indeterminate in certain ways, and that can be rectified, whatever, if you desire it, by kind of this supervaluation procedure.
Yeah. I think the idea ultimately goes back to Bertrand Russell. There's a paper by Bertrand Russell published many years ago in the AJP, if I remember rightly, in which basically Russell says vagueness is a semantic phenomenon, as we'd say it in modern terminology.
First edition of the AJP, 1923. The AJP is 100 years old this year. Hooray!
No. Well, the last application of the possible worlds that I wanted to talk about, I suppose, is probably more in Graham's neighborhood this time than the mental content. And that is his writing on fiction. And I suppose that it might have to do with you, Graham, because you also obviously have written and thought a lot about fictional objects. And I'm not actually sure if his writing on fiction was related to possible worlds, but I just am assuming that we can make sense of the truths of statements about Sherlock Holmes or other fictional objects by somehow looking at possible worlds in which they're true.
No, indeed, it was totally connected with worlds. So David has a very nice paper where he talks about truth in fiction. And let me keep this simple. Take a statement such as Sherlock Holmes lived in Baker Street. Okay, now setting all the counterpart theory stuff aside, because it just complicates matters, what does it mean to say Sherlock Holmes lived in Baker Street? Well, it's not true. There was never any Sherlock Holmes in Baker Street, but it's true in the Doyle fictions, right? What does that mean? Well, it means that in every possible world that realizes the Doyle fiction, in other words, makes the things that Doyle said true, Sherlock Holmes lives in Baker Street. And, you know, the full analysis was more complicated than that to handle the complexities, but that's essentially it. So he cashed out truth in fiction in terms of truth in all worlds of a certain kind. Now, I think that is right. I mean, I disagree with David about his view of the status of worlds, but I think his view is essentially correct. Where we differ about that is that I think there are inconsistent fictions which are deliberately inconsistent, okay, where the inconsistency is not an accident or an oversight, but deliberately so. And if you subscribe to essentially this account of truth in fiction, that means there have got to be inconsistent worlds, if you like, impossible worlds. Now, David really liked possible worlds. He did not like impossible worlds. And there's a bit of a story about this because I remember having a long discussion with David once. I forget where we were, but David had this view that if you meet an inconsistent fiction, what you do is fragment it. So you break it up into two fictions, essentially. One horn of the contradiction holds in one world or bunch of worlds, and the other horn holds in the other world. So you've got to render them consistent in some sense. And that struck me as crazy because I remember having this argument with David. I said, look, there must be stories where you can't, that doesn't make sense to do it that way. And David said, I don't think so. And I said, I bet there is. And so I sat down and I wrote Sylvan's Box. So Sylvan's Box is a story that is deliberately contradictory. And if you break the story up into consistent chunks, you don't get it. Okay. You've got to have the contradiction in the one and only world that realize, or one in the worlds that realize the story. Otherwise, you know, it's just wrong. Okay. So I wrote this story and I sent it to David, and he had to admit that he'd been wrong in the past. So, I mean, as I said, you know, David wasn't the sort of person who would hang on to his theory come what may. He would admit to being wrong when he thought he was wrong. And this was one of the rare occasions where I actually got him to admit that he was wrong. But he did. And he said he didn't quite know what to say about this. He wasn't going to buy into impossible worlds. That was a bridge too far. But he did agree that his account of, you know, breaking up the contradictions into two parts didn't work. So that's a bit of a story about David.
And a good story. Are there any other aspects of possible worlds that you wanted to get into or thought we should touch on before we moved on?
Well, one thing just worth mentioning quickly is he also liked the use of possible worlds in spelling out what materialism was saying. Because remember, the idea of materialism, in some sense, the material way things are determines without remainder the psychological way things are. And I've just uttered some words which I hope meant something, but it's sort of be nice to have an analysis of what exactly you mean when you say the material or physical way things are determines without remainder the psychological way things are. And there are like possible worlds there because you can translate that in terms of possible worlds using the notion of supervenience. So that's another case where he was using possible worlds to articulate a view he liked, namely materialism.
Yeah, so you're talking about the identity theory of the mind.
That's right, but he wanted a way, of course he thought brain states are mental states, but he wanted a way of expressing materialism which was neutral on whether you thought you should be more of a behaviorist or more of a functionalist, or whether it was type or token, all sorts of things you might say, a more detailed kind. He wanted a way of saying, what's the basic thought I've got? And what's the basic thought? Take any world like this one. In physical regards, it'll be exactly like this one in psychological regards. That's how you do it. Now, I've left out lots of frills because actually that's not quite right. But that's the basic thought. Yes. Here's the background. The first bit of background is he wrote a paper called An Argument for the Identity Theory. As a graduate student, I mean, really was a bit intimidating. It was a very important paper on the identity theory written by a graduate student. What he does in this paper is he says, look, take Jack Smart's idea, and Jack Smart taught Lewis at Harvard when Jack was visiting Harvard. Take Jack's view, forget about all the stuff about parsimony, as you've just mentioned, nomological danglers. There's a much simpler argument, and here it is. Mental states play causal roles. What causal roles? Science will tell us. When we do the science, it's going to turn out to be neuroscientific states that play those causal roles. We then use the transitive identity. Nothing about Occam, nothing about nomological danglers, which will mean something to those who know Smart's famous original paper on the identity theory. We just use the transitive identity to conclude that mental states are brain states. So that's basically the story he told in that very early paper he wrote as a graduate student. So that's the basic picture. But then later on, of course, he wanted to express the idea there's some generally overall materialistic picture. And my version, which is like Armstrong's, is certainly a kind of materialism, but wouldn't it be nice if we had a way of expressing the general materialistic thought which animates people like Smart, Armstrong, Lewis, and so on, and Feigl? And the supervenience way, in terms of possible worlds, was the way he did that.